We still wrote letters then, reflections of 2 years in the life of a humanitarian aid working, conscious that the culture of letter writing has largely been lost. Diana Miserez felt urged to share in print some of the letters exchanged mainly between herself and her parents through the years she worked as a humanitarian aid worker with the United Nations Refugee Agency and the International Red Cross. Delighted to be joining me live on the line is Diana Miserez herself. Diana, good morning to you.
Good morning, Mr. Brown.
Good to have you. Please call me Giles. Good to have you with us. We still wrote letters then, because in an age of email, texting, WhatsApping, do we think the art of writing letters has somewhat been lost?
Well, I think it's very much been lost. Everybody I've spoken to about writing this book, they said, well done, because we no longer write letters. We have SMS, we have this and that and the other technological marvel to adhere to, but we don't write letters.
So tell me a little bit about your background then, and why your path led you to becoming a humanitarian aid worker.
Well, after school in Solihull, I was at university in Bristol and found that very many of my fellow students were refugees from Eastern Europe. And I got involved a little bit with them, with their story. I felt that I'd had a very, very privileged life up to the age of 19, and that I'd do well to get into work with some of these people. And then I got into UNHCR in Geneva, and went on from there. Most of my adult life I've been concerned with refugee situations, and have held posts in all sorts of areas of UNHCR's activity.
And which was your first assignment? What was your first, when you first got your boots on the ground, as it were?
Well, I had two positions in Geneva which were absolutely marvelous, very taxing, but then I found myself in the Great Lakes area of Africa when there'd been the first outpourings of refugees from Rwanda. I was there for a year and a half, and at a later date I was back in that part of Africa, but just the other side of the Congo border, in charge of a small delegation to help other refugees from Rwanda who needed settling. Or actually from Burundi, sorry. Refugees from Burundi, where I lived.
The book is...
I had to organize a settlement on agricultural land of thousands of these Hutu refugees.
The book itself focuses on 2 years. Is that correct? And why these particular sort of 2 years?
Well, I've picked out those 2 years out of all the years that my good parents, although they had quite busy lives, one way or another, but they gave me their fullest support with weekly letters, beautiful letters. And recently, when I came upon this stack of letters going over years, I thought, well, these are historical documents in a sense, because everything has changed since those 2 years that I was first in Laos for UNHCR, and very soon afterwards in Congo, where, of course, life was anything but routine. All sorts of things happened. In the first case, it was Cambodia, and then Vietnam, and then Laos, who fell to the communist regimes within days, almost within days of my getting there. So everything changed there, and we had to adapt to all these changes, realizing that most Europeans and other expatriates and hundreds of thousands of Lao had fled Laos, as well as huge numbers, of course, of Cambodians and Vietnamese. Later, it was the boat people who hit the headlines, the people who got into little flimsy fishing boats to try and escape the communist regime that they found come upon their country.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because people will remember the fall of Vietnam. People will remember the fall of Cambodia and the horrors of the Khmer Rouge. But Laos is somewhat overlooked, isn't it? If you look back, I mean, this being a revision of history. But at the time, as you said, in the mid to late 70s, Vietnamese boat people heading to Hong Kong was a major news story.
Yes, that's right. But in Laos, it was a quieter revolution. There was no sudden seizure of the capital city, as had happened with Phnom Penh, with tragic consequences, and as had happened with Saigon, very quickly renamed Ho Chi Minh Ville. It was a quiet revolution in Laos. But nevertheless, the first to go were hill people, 45,000 hill people who crossed the Mekong, imagining that everything would work out for them, and then finding that they were practically destitute and without any hope of a satisfactory future. So for years and years, those poor people were in camps in northern Thailand, and I remember seeing them there. The ladies who had done such extraordinary embroidery in the center of the little capital city, Vientiane, were now carrying on embroidering, but with great haste in order to try and raise a bit of money to supplement their very meager food distributions that the Thai government saw to.
And so when you arrive sort of in somewhere like northern Thailand to try and help or to try and perhaps bring relief, what were the sort of things that you were doing?
Well, I didn't actually work in northern Thailand. I was visiting these people. I worked in Laos only, where we were receiving relief, all sorts of quantities of relief from Europe and I suppose further afield, and sending it on to Vietnam for distribution in Vietnam. So we had a team in Vietnam seeing to the distribution along with government people, of course. And within Laos, we were particularly involved in moving 900,000 people who'd been displaced by the terrible bombings of the 70s, early 70s. And we got these people back to their home villages along with those belongings that they had. We were transporting poultry and bicycles and sewing machines and all sorts of things up to the northern Laos. And that was our main activity in Laos. But while we were helping 900,000 people to regain their roots in the mountainous areas of northern Laos, we were conscious that ever so many Laotians from the hills were crossing the Mekong as refugees. So it was a very strange period, but it was very stimulating to be there, even though we were working probably far too hard and getting very exhausted, but we knew we were doing what had to be done. And the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees was involved also in trying to repair the relationship, being asked to try to repair the relationship between Vietnam and the USA. So we had a mission accompanying American congressmen to Hanoi and helping pave the way for them, for USA to have a relationship with Vietnam, which they had so brutally bombed during the early years of the 70s.
So what was Africa? Was it, forgive me, were you in the Congo, was it you said you were?
I was first in Burundi. Burundi was chosen for a regional office, which was the first time UNHCR had ventured into Africa, into operational work, because it was nearest to the concentrations of refugees from Rwanda who were in Uganda, Congo, Burundi, and Tanzania. So we were relatively close to the geographical areas where there were tens of thousands of refugees from Rwanda. And then 11 years later, it was the refugees from Burundi that I was concerned with. In both of those periods, it was a question of trying to settle people on land, which was more difficult for the people from Rwanda because they were cattle herders. They'd never chopped down trees and dug into the earth. They'd always had others to do that for them. So we were helping former cattle herders to try and settle. But then in 1994, you'll all remember the terrible genocide in Rwanda. But at a time that Tutsis were managing to take their country back from a Hutu dictatorial regime. So most of those tens of thousands that we'd helped in the 60s and 70s were able to go back in the 90s to their homeland.
The letters themselves, which you exchanged with your parents. But it just, when you rediscover something like that, obviously, it must be a fascinating insight about, where you were on your journey 40 years ago. And also presumably it's covering not only sort of operational situations, but also the minutiae of daily life.
Yes, I think there's quite a lot covered in those letters that I sent home. And I was writing, of course, to quite a circle of wonderful friends, and even to someone like the Bishop of Coventry at that time, who was in touch with me. He thought he knew me pretty well before I went off back to UNHCR. So a lot was covered. A lot of the cultural habits of the Lao, for instance, were described. And I was honored to be invited to a wedding in Laos and to a funeral in Laos, and I was the only foreigner amongst all these Lao people, but who were friends of mine. I felt very close to some of these Lao people who worked in our office and who were very open and friendly until communist methods changed the situation, and people were expected not to be in touch with foreigners under any circumstances. So the situation changed in those 12 months that I lived in Vientiane.
And what was it like, excuse me, what was it like rediscovering these letters then and rereading them and putting them together for your book?
Well, it carried me back to those periods, of course, when I was active in, particularly in Congo, in organizing a future for refugees who had been waiting for years to have a chance to cultivate land and look after themselves. And I was a lone woman, actually. I was, as I put somewhere, rather prey to male Africans who thought that perhaps they could get into my bed somehow. So that was one of the reasons that I declined to stay a second year in Congo, although the Ethiopian boss in Kinshasa expected me to stay a second year, but I really didn't want to. But it was a very stimulating year, and I had a most marvelous deputy who spoke Swahili and very quickly picked up all the sort of rules about working for UNHCR and devising programs for refugees and so on. So I had a very good year there too, and it's been a pleasure to look back on it and sort of relive those experiences and remember some of the amusement and remember some of the escapes from horrible accidents as well, because life was never tranquil, either in Congo or in Laos. So it was two momentous periods that I was, as it were, bringing to this book. And I very much hope that people will find it of interest to plunge into those situations, albeit decades after they actually occurred.
And there is something, isn't there, about holding a piece of paper? Because let's face it, nobody's going to look back at their emails, are they, from 5 years ago and go, yes, I remember that. So there is, if you have the physical proof of a letter in your hand, there is something of the time capsule in it.
Yes, and we've given examples of some of the letters that I received in the paper cover of the book. People will see the trouble my parents went through and the trouble others went through to send me interesting letters, and some of which never reached me because postal services were not perfect. So there are letters that were missing. But piecing that all together, I brought out a book that I do hope people will find sufficiently fascinating. And certainly the former chief of personnel of UNHCR, she came as a young lawyer into the job and held it for 20 years. She's now just turned 90, but she's rung me 3 times to say how excited she is about this book and how fascinating she finds it, which is nice.
Absolutely wonderful. The book is called We Still Wrote Letters Then. It's by Diana Miserez. Diana, thank you so much for your time today.
Well, it's been great talking with you. Thank you so much. Thank you.